So my name is Petty Officer Sam Quinn. I'm in the Royal Navy. I'm an aircraft engineer at 825 Naval Air Squadron. I'm also a member of RN Campus, the Navy's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Network. I was invited here today to give a talk about what the Navy has done recently to come up so high in the Workplace Equality Index and give a bit of perspective about how your own LGBT network could maybe improve in the future. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to speak to you, and really honoured, in fact, that I was invited. I hope I can cover everything that you would like to know this morning. As I was preparing to write my presentation to you, Stonewall released their 2019 Workplace Equality Index, and we came up 17 places to equal 15th. So a little bit of a title reorder is in order. So Royal Navy, LGBT, Inclusivity, 20 years to the top 20, I think is a little more appropriate. So, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Sam Quinn. I currently live in Somerset with my husband of 5 years and our dog Rocco. I'm originally from Birmingham, and I joined the Royal Navy on the 21st of October 2012, which was the 107th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. That's really significant if you're in the Navy. After training, I joined 702 Squadron and then 815 Squadron, working with the Mark 8 Lynx helicopter, the predecessor to that one. I deployed on HMS Kent on Operation Kipium, which is a long-standing UK maritime presence in the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean, ensuring stability in the region and a safe flow of trade. When I got back to the UK, I joined HMS Sultan for trade and leadership training. After studying and passing my certificate of competency for supervising aircraft maintenance at HMS Heron, I then joined 825 and 815 Squadron, working on the Wildcat Mark II helicopter, which is that lovely creature you see there. I deployed on HMS Duncan on a NATO immediate reaction force made up of vessels of various nations, participating in military exercises, humanitarian relief and international relationship building. So if you saw the documentary Warship Life at Sea, which was on Channel 5 earlier in the year, last year, I was actually on that ship a few weeks before they started filming, so I missed my opportunity for fame. Once back in the UK again, after that, I started my latest set of technical and then leadership training, to be promoted to the rank of Petty Officer, which is what I am now. I'm now based in Somerset since July, and I'm a watch manager and a senior aircraft avionics supervisor working on the Wildcats, as I mentioned. During my time in the Royal Navy, I've also done adventure training in Wales, Gibraltar, Crete, France and Germany. I've been lucky enough to take part in competitive sport, inter-service cross-country and snowboarding championships, as well as the Brickwoods field gun competition. I've been openly gay my whole career, and last year I marched with the Royal Navy at Pride in London, which was in the video just there, which I count as a real career highlight, one of the best days that I've spent serving so far. I hope to continue to support Campus in the future and the wider RN as well, which is kind of what led me here today. So I'll introduce the talk. So this afternoon, almost, I'd like to talk about a journey that the Navy has taken. So from the historical attitude towards LGBT personnel in the military, to what happens to cause the mod to lift the ban, and the reaction to it. And then I'll talk about the attitude and the action since, before rounding up with some of the future and current challenges that we're facing. Hopefully it'll take about 45 minutes to get through all of that. My research included open source information gathering, talking with veterans and current service personnel, as well as members of Campus and the D&I policymakers in the Royal Navy. As far as questions go, please note them down and I will welcome them at the end. But if there's anything that you don't understand as we're going through, if I'm talking too quickly, or if I slip into Jack speak, which is like Navy slang, and I start calling that a deck, and these things bulkheads, and you don't know what I'm going on about, just stop me and I'll explain. So the last thing I also need to mention is, especially in the historical section of my talk, the debate at the time mainly revolved around gay men. So the word homosexual may refer to that, and the language will be quite revolving around gay men. As the talk goes on, the language changes, becomes a bit more up to date. So without further ado, let's begin. There have always been LGBT personnel in the military, until shockingly recently, they've had to stay in hiding from their peers and their chain of command for fear of discovery and ultimately dismissal. Last month, the Navy became the #1 company in defence for LGBT inclusivity. So what happened to bring a 1,000-year-old organisation into the 21st century, and what's our future heading? I'd like to talk first about the historical attitudes towards LGBT personnel. So the Royal Navy has only allowed LGBT personnel to serve from the 12th of January 2000. For some perspective, they've only allowed women to serve since 1993. That's in the regular service, sorry. For a very long time, there was a long-standing attitude that there was no place for gay men in the military. Anecdotally, the MOD's viewpoint was essentially based on 3 points. The most rational one was a fear that gay men could be blackmailed. The risk of sensitive information being extracted by foreign intelligence was a legitimate concern, and helps explain why the MOD didn't change their policy when the Sexual Offences Act 1967 came into force, which legalised gay sex between consenting men over the age of 21 in private. Despite changes in the law which made homosexual acts between consenting adults in private no longer a criminal offence, the risk of blackmail or pressure in homosexual cases would remain substantial. The next rested on a perception of promiscuity, a higher incidence of STIs, and later the rise of HIV/AIDS. And then lastly, there was an endemic attitude towards gay men as inferior. As Air Vice Marshal John Lamonti points out in his paper, Attitudes in Britain Towards its Armed Forces, as sexuality increasingly defined gender during the late 19th and 20th centuries, so gay men were forced out of the masculine camp as viewed by straight men. The significance of this lies in the perception of the military as being strongly masculine, such that the extreme nature of combat is assessed to require the peak of masculinity to achieve success. This was the ideology underpinning the national objection to homosexuals serving in the military in Western countries. Homosexuality was viewed as demeaning, something used to belittle others. Of course, the benefit of hindsight reveals that these objections to homosexual serving were pretty foundless. On the basis of masculinity, the issue is that traits such as leadership and courage, commitment, integrity were confused with masculinity. These traits are central to an effective fighting force. However, they are separate from masculinity. Someone does not have to present in a masculine way to be brave. Take able seaman, who is now Chief Petty Officer Kate Nesbitt. She won the Military Cross for exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy on land during an ambush by the Taliban in 2009. We have great examples of leaders who have the traits needed but would not fit this confused definition of masculine. Also like Commander Eleanor Stack, who was the CO of my last ship, HMS Duncan. And captains and medal winners, they're fantastic role models, but even on a more day-to-day personal level, I know of a number of LGBT senior-8 and officers who are the leaders of today and the senior leadership of the future, and they are incredibly well respected by their peers, their subordinates and their managers just for doing the job they do, proving that you don't have to be the peak of masculinity to achieve success. The other objections I talked about, promiscuity, is somewhat ironic when considering a sailor's reputation. So yes, a high incidence of STIs on board a ship would have an impact on operational capability. However, sailors have always had a reputation of promiscuity. So it's not clear why they expected these incidences to rise if they allowed homosexuals to serve, especially considering men and women were already serving together in ships and there was a code of conduct against ship's company having sexual relationships on board. As for the last objection, blackmail, I suppose the paradox of a banned behaviour being cause for blackmail was missed for a great many years. So simply stop banning it and people can't be blackmailed with it anymore. Of course, it's easy to condemn those in the past with naivety. Clearly it was more complicated than that. There were social pressures and acceptance which hadn't moved on yet. So many were still ashamed of their orientation for coming out. Nevertheless, if they had removed the repercussions of being gay, there would be no consequences of reporting a blackmail attempt, ensuring that it does get reported. And from an operational capability point of view, that seems reason enough to remove the ban for me. From talking with straight and gay veterans of the time, homosexuality was less and less of an issue as time went on. The policy was still in force, and it was enforced where it was found by the chain of command. But where individuals became aware of each other's homosexuality or another person's homosexuality, it was not an issue. Interestingly, this put what we now call allies, that being LGBT allies, not the military kind, at risk. As under service law, they were duty-bound to report any crime that they became aware of. But the heartening thing is that amongst the lads and lasses of the Royal Navy, in the 90s, it was finally getting to the point where homosexuality wasn't an issue for them. But what about being LGBT at that time? What about your social circle in a time before end-to-end encrypted communication in the palm of your hand? Support and social networking and for gay and lesbian sailors did exist, but only in very close, discrete groups and certainly not in a service-wide capacity. In 1992, Rank Outsiders was established by Robert Ely. It was a support network for gay and lesbian veterans dismissed because of their orientation. The group also linked and supported serving personnel, but those personnel had to be very discreet in their dealings with the group, and I'll speak a little bit more about that group later. So there was no official network for serving LGBT personnel until Proud to Serve came along, which was formed in 2002 and was adopted into the service in 2008. And then it was given a responsibility to the wider service to help advertise, help and support and inform on policy. So although mindsets were liberalising outside of the military and RM personnel seemed to not have a problem with homosexuals on board, the policy was still anti-LGBT. And although the government acknowledged that it was time for change, not much was actually done about it. In 1995, the Labour Party said that when they came to power, they would examine the question of homosexuality in the armed forces. The Shadow Defence Secretary at the time, George Robertson, said that the policy would be reviewed in the Strategic Defence Review in 1997-98. The actual white paper has no mention whatsoever of LGBT matters. So we come to what changed. How did we move from the environment where the options were keep quiet or be dismissed to acceptance? It began with Rank Outsiders. They were working with Stonewall in 1995, launching a major campaign to end the ban. They provided evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee on the Armed Forces, which led the incumbent Conservative government to promise to stop the criminal prosecution of gay and lesbian servicemen and women. However, by the end of their term, that hadn't happened, and under Labour, it still hadn't happened by 1999. So the most pivotal point for LGBT inclusivity in the military ended up being a court case. Lustig-Prean and Beckett versus the United Kingdom. A case brought by Lieutenant Commander Duncan Lustig-Prean, seen on the left, who was sacked following an anonymous tip-off to Special Investigations Branch, the section of the Service Police which dealt with those matters at the time, and weapons engineer John Beckett, who's on the right, who was sacked after confiding his sexuality confidentially to the chaplain. So the case was eventually taken to the European Court of Human Rights as a contravention of the human rights and fundamental freedoms, namely the right to respect of your private life. The court notes and final ruling are, of course, available open source, and they do make for a very interesting read. It's only about half an hour, 45-minute read. So Lustig-Prean and Beckett, the two personnel in the middle are on the left, Jeanette Smith and Graham Grady on the right. They were RAF personnel. Their case was combined with Lustig-Prean and Beckett to take to the ECHR. So Lustig-Prean and Beckett, who I'll call now LP and B, alleged that their dismissal and the incredibly invasive nature of the ensuing investigation violated their right to privacy. The British government's main defence during the trial rested upon a report by the Homosexual Policy Assessment Team in February '96 that found the current LGBT policy was still the right stance and therefore should be upheld and enforced. I'll talk a little bit more about the HPAC because I think you'll find that quite interesting. So the purpose of the Homosexual Policy Assessment Team was an internal assessment of the Armed Forces policy on homosexuality. The starting point of the assessment was an assumption that homosexual men and women were in themselves no less physically capable, brave, dependable and skilled than heterosexuals, which is a positive point. The assessment aimed only to prove the difficulties of integration of homosexuals into a heterosexually dominated service, which again initially sounds good, but you examine that a little deeper, and that means that their starting point assumed that heterosexuals would be at worst hostile and at best unwelcoming to homosexuals. However, the report did not stand up to close examination when taken to the ECHR. It was carried out by civil service and military personnel. The sample size was particularly small. There were leading questions in the survey, and many of the research techniques used weren't anonymous. So whether the poor integrity of the report was by design or whether it was just bad science is not something we'll really explore. But its conclusion echoed its introductory assumption, and it found that 90% of service personnel would prefer not to serve alongside homosexuals, meaning that if they did, it would affect morale and therefore negatively operational effectiveness. So we'll go back to the case. LP&B put forward their exemplary service records, and the MOD conceded that there was no indication that their homosexuality had negatively impacted their service. They took issue with the searches and seizure of personal effects and photographs, and the indecent questions put to them by the service police. They also argued that the RN's concern about risk to morale was unsustainable for 3 reasons. The MOD cannot pander to the perceived prejudices of serving personnel. So, for example, if you found that an organisation was racist, you couldn't put in force policy to exclude black people because you're going the wrong way around that. You should enforce policy to make it more inclusive. Second, the perceived prejudice was a result of the MOD's policy in the first place. So if they didn't have a homophobic policy, there would be no cause for the personnel to be homophobic. The government could not substantiate their concern about a risk to morale or OC. So the third point was that there was absolutely no objective evidence whatsoever that where homosexuals were found serving, that there was a negative impact on OC. Operational command, sorry. Needless to say, the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR, considered all aspects of the case quite thoroughly, and they ruled that the MOD had indeed violated LP&B's right to a private life and ruled in their favour. The UK government had to repeal their homophobic policies, which came into effect on the 12th of January 2000. The importance of LP&B versus UK cannot be underestimated. Overnight, the MOD had to stop investigations into LGBT personnel. As LP said, that gay people can sleep a little easier tonight and not fear a knock on the door from the military police. It laid the foundation for the good work that the RN and the wider MOD does on the front of diversity and inclusion, and was, in a way, the first step that finds us here at 15 on the WEI. But back then, it was still a long way off. So how did the change affect those personnel serving? Was there a day of celebration, or was there widespread intolerance? In fact, there was a considerable lack of any day-to-day change whatsoever. The MOD's fear of a huge drop in morale and fighting capability proved to be unfounded. There was a Guardian article 6 months after lifting of the ban. And it said, there is widespread acceptance of the new policy. It has not been an issue of great debate. In fact, there has been a marked lack of reaction. This report shows that the worst fears of some politicians have come to nothing. Opposition to gay law reform, whether over Section 28, the age of consent, or military service, is repeatedly rooted in unrealistic fears of the consequences. From rank outsiders, the MOD has asked us to go straight to them with any cases of bullying and have assured us that they will be dealt with at the highest levels. The services are not just a job, they're a way of life, and some people had all of that taken away from them for no reason. So we see that in the 6 months, personnel have had no negative reaction. The MOD include lesbians and gays under their anti-bullying umbrella, and morale may well have improved, certainly for those people who no longer had to fear being outed. What I think the RN got right is that from the beginning, there was ownership of this policy from the top down. So this is Admiral Key speaking in 2017, I think, but the sentiment stands. So the senior echelons of the military, those writing the policy and those enforcing the policy, were now in support of lesbian and gay people. As someone said, and I've not managed to find the article again since reading it, which is incredibly annoying, yesterday we had one policy which was correct, and today we have a new policy that's correct, and it was that simple. For many who were in service at the time, the widespread attitude really revolved around the idea of, if they can do their job, then their private life isn't any of my concern. So now lesbians and gays, although perhaps not celebrated, were at least more included. As I mentioned, there was now support and protection under service discrimination laws, like there already was for racism and sexism. The Code of Conduct was rewritten to be much more inclusive and has stood the test of time, as it really hasn't changed much since it was rewritten following LP&B. But apart from the policy change and the cessation of investigations, which I grant you are big changes, nothing else really changed in personnel's day-to-day. We achieved the same goals with the same people pretty much in the same way. But what did change for the LGBT community is that overnight they'd gone from fear investigation to a knowledge of support, and that difference was profound. So what the Navy has done in the past 20 years is fostered a culture, and it recruits the right people and it trains them in the right way to ensure that an inclusive culture that polices itself generally at the lowest levels. And it instills a confidence in everyone that if there's a serious problem and it's reported, then it will be dealt with along the system of military discipline, and it will have your back. So I mentioned the sort of if they can do their job, then their private life is no concern of mine attitude. It was fairly widespread and accepted. It was easy to comprehend and useful to explain to anybody that had a problem with LGBT people that other people's private lives didn't matter to them. However, times are moving on. It's no longer sufficient to simply accept and to a certain extent ignore people's backgrounds. To get the most out of our people, we must value each sailor or marine as an individual, and it's becoming increasingly important for everybody's manager to know them on a personal level. And it seems obvious that if your boss takes the time to get to know you as a person, what makes you tick, and then they make decisions regarding you, they're going to make them in a more thoughtful way. And also, you're going to trust that your manager has made decisions about you in a more thoughtful way, which makes you feel more valued. We need to move away from a passive disinterest in our people's personal lives and start asking, how can I make this a place where my team can thrive? So in regards to attitudes, I've skipped ahead a little there for the flow of my presentation. I just want to take a little step back again and look at why the RN is such a great place for LGBT personnel to work. Of course, we had the Workplace Equality Index, the WEI, come out last month, and that placed us at 15. And that's a great benchmark to see how we're doing as an employer. The reason the Royal Navy takes part in the WEI is nicely summed up by Admiral Sir George Zembellas, formerly the first Sea Lord, speaking in 2016. It is a ringing endorsement of our efforts, led by diversity champions, to ensure we remain one of the most attractive employers in the UK. It also goes to show that if you're good enough, it doesn't matter who you are. Anyone can succeed in the Royal Navy. Diversity is also about being the best Navy in the world. The Royal Navy's strength rests on our men and women in all their glorious diversity. Their skill, their determination, their ability to think and fight determines our success. The Navy has taken part in the Workplace Equality Index for a while, but it has done particularly well in the past few years. We were 10th in 2017, 32nd in 2018, and rose up again to 15th in 2019, and there's several reasons why. Each organisation, this is a little précis of what the WI does. Each organisation must demonstrate their expertise in 10 areas of employment policy and practice, including networking groups, senior leadership, procurement, and how well they've engaged with LGBT+ communities. To supplement evidence submitted by employers, Stonewall also seeks feedback directly from entrance staff. Every 3 years, entrants are given a new set of questions which they're evaluated against. In 2017, that was the first year in our latest cycle of questions. And something that really helped us is we were given questions about trans matters. So this was great because there's already a JSP, which is a sort of top-level tri-service policy about trans matters, and we had a Navy-specific trans policy as well. Trans matters are also included in D&I training, diversity and inclusion D&I training every year. So we were already ahead of the curve on that one. But of course, we're not perfect, and there's always room for improvement. We adjusted and tweaked the policy in a subtle way, sometimes just language changes, to more accurately reflect the current conversation going on. And we needed to do more in our actions. So the D&I Policy Desk produced a book, Transgender Awareness, a guide for naval service people, explaining trans matters in plain English to encourage positive communication and avoid offence around a topic lots of people find difficult. The book was distributed both online and in hard copy to all living quarters, squadrons, ships across the fleet, and received a very positive feedback, including from individuals who had sort of heard of trans matters. They'd heard it on the wind in the news, but didn't have the language to talk about it. And this gave them that. Also, we had a look at people's journey through their naval service. And Stonewall pointed out that it should be made clear right from the very outset the Royal Navy's policy on D&I. But it was found that the people doing the recruiting weren't actually very knowledgeable about it. It was found that the personnel doing it were white, in their 40s and 50s. They had 20 to 30 years service. They were in the last 2 years of their service and had spent time in that pre-2000 era. So they were very much of the, if you can do your job, your private life is none of my concern mindset, which was fine, but they weren't of the sort of celebrating the individual mindset. So in response, recruiters now get advanced D&I training, specifically reference LGBT matters, to ensure that they can combat any unconscious bias they might have. And so that they can understand that the Navy they're leaving is one that's moved on significantly from the one that they joined. This training has a two-pronged result, so it informs any potential recruits that the Royal Navy will welcome them regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, as well as informing that intolerant behaviour is not welcome to any potential recruits that might be so inclined. Further positive actions that helped us come up in the Workplace Equality Index included a raft of events, some abroad and including a lot of firsts. We had the Parade of Sail in London, where LGBT young people were invited aboard HMS Exploit and Blazer in the top left picture there, and sailed under Tower Bridge as it was lifted, along with police, fire service, the RNLI, all flying rainbow flags. We also, again, attended Pride in London. This year was the Navy's turn to lead from defence, and due to a huge effort from members of Campus, we had one of the best years yet. We were able to include LGBT Royal Marines marching for the first time, and with the band of the Royal Marines leading our platoon. Most of the Marines there were allies, including the Captain General Royal Marines and this warrant officer, who really are leading from the front in the Corps to ensure that we celebrate, not just tolerate people's differences. In 2017, the RN also marched in our first foreign Pride in Washington in the US, and last year we were also involved at Rome Pride. And finally, the Royal Navy Parachute Display Team opened UK Pride on the Isle of Wight, flying the White Ensign and the Pride flag. So the Royal Navy has had a few very visible years as a diversity champion. We've had a few small policy changes, and we've done some really big actions that have really helped us come up in the WEI. And there's a lot of people, LGBT and allies, that have done a lot of work for D&I, and they're very proud of the work we've done too. I think rightfully so. So where next from where we are now? The way the policy desk sees it, and I tend to agree with them, we have two major challenges in the next few years. One of them is enduring change. So the RN has done really well in the past few years. We've ticked all the boxes and we can prove that we can do things in a best practice kind of way. Informed and supported by Stonewall, of course. But we must be careful that that's not all it is. If the only reason we've been so visible and active on LGBT policy is to tick Stonewall's boxes and gain places on the WEI, we're doing it all for the wrong reasons. Campus and the D&I policy team have a voice in the ear of Navy Command and have and are proving the benefits of the work that we do. So policy changes that have been made and adopted into the BR3, which is our sort of go-to book on personnel management. And more importantly, there is investment and ownership in the idea of inclusivity, so the upper echelons understand the value of it and they are driving the positive changes that we want to see right from the top. So I think we're on track to tackle our first challenge of enduring change. The other big challenge we see is on the topic of gender. So this is where I see the D&I versus OC, operational capability discussion, starting to become more difficult. The conversation around gender is moving very quickly and it's constantly evolving. Ruth Hunt, the CEO of Stonewall, has acknowledged that their own policy needs to change almost as quickly as they can write it. So the RN, where gender policy isn't exactly one of our priorities, should we say, we can only really do our best. I'll say a primary concern rather than priority. I'll quickly digress here to show you a resource Campus published about 2 years ago to help provide the language to talk about sexuality, sex and gender. So we'll look at 4 elements in turn of our gender-bred sailor and Royal Marine. This will help us move forward a little. So the first is biological sex. These are the physical sex characteristics we are born with and develop, including our genitals, our chromosomes, body hair, etc. We tend to view this as being binary, either male or female. However, there are a range of variations in nature described as being intersex, and they're surprisingly common, almost as common as having red hair, in fact. The second element is your identity. This is how you, in your head, think about yourself and define your gender. Again, we tend to think of it being binary, man or woman. But in some societies, there are more than two gender options. The third element is your expression, the way that you present your gender. So through the ways that you act, dress, and behave. It's also about how others interpret your gender expression based upon society's gender norms. So gender expression can change from day to day, situation to situation, even outfit to outfit. It's about how the way you express yourself aligns with sort of traditional views of femininity and masculinity. So what we have on the screen so far are three elements that make up your overall sense of gender. Hopefully you can see that they're interrelated, but they are actually independent of one another. The three elements of gender can align. So somebody's biological sex is male, they're raised as a boy, they identify as a man, and they express in a way that society perceives to be masculine. So that might be what we call cisgendered. But we can see that there's many more combinations possible, and actually there's a huge richness of diversity just in this area. The element that we haven't covered so far is sexual orientation. This is about who you are physically, spiritually, and emotionally attracted to. So if you're male and you're attracted to females, you're straight. If you're a male who's attracted to males and females, you're bisexual. And if you're a male who's attracted to males, then you're gay. But is it actually that simple? These definitions are based on your biological sex. So what about those who are intersex and might not believe or might not recognize attraction in terms of same sex or opposite sex? What about if you identify as a straight man, but you're comfortable with your partner being a trans woman? Or if you identify as a gay man, but you're a biologically born female? So there's a problem here with lots of labels and preconceptions, which boils down to people being too concerned about what genitals other people have. And really, it's nobody's business, is it? So the point is, sexual orientation doesn't determine someone's gender expression. Gender expression isn't determined by gender identity, and gender identity isn't determined by biological sex. The elements can affect one another, but they don't determine one another. So that's probably a lot to take in. I'll leave that slide up for a while. The thing to take away is that our people are complex and we're all different. By increasing our awareness, we can improve our understanding, making our workplaces and our behaviour and environments more inclusive. Our people basically will perform better when they can be themselves at work. So on to the actual challenges that we see coming up. Up until now, it's been clear that someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is not an issue because it doesn't make a difference how productive they are at work. And in fact, celebrating their differences makes them more productive. That has been seen and that has been proven, and there's no problem with that whatsoever. However, the Royal Navy's trans policy is currently based upon a binary view of gender. So we have men's and women's accommodations, toilets, fitness standards, uniforms. So the Royal Navy is comfortable with the idea of trans men and trans women because the transition fits into the binary systems we have. Then, as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, a trans person can change their sex without too much bother or disruption, from the Royal Navy's point of view at least. On their chosen date, they change their uniform, they use the other bathroom, and at the appropriate point, then they can adopt the fitness standard for their gender, similar to international and national sporting standards, so we're not really alone in that scope. However, as the conversation about gender develops, and as in our society we realise that trans comes to be a bit of an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity, expression, behaviour, etc. doesn't conform to that traditionally associated with the sex they're assigned at birth. So if you consider trans as an umbrella term, for a plethora of identities and expressions, then trans becomes a lot more difficult to write, let alone enforce policy for. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I hope I told you a bit about what you wanted to know. Hopefully I informed you a little bit about the attitudes in the RN before the Lustig-Prean and Beckett case, and give you an insight into how we've operated since 2000 and a few of the things we're looking at in the future. With a little luck, I haven't completely lost you along the way, but if anybody has any questions, I would be delighted to take them now. So I was really pleased to be invited to the Wellcome Genome Campus today, and I think the discussion went really well. I think it's important to discuss these sort of topics in a scientific and research environment. We find that in the Navy, when we celebrate, not just tolerate our people's differences, it makes them much more productive, and that's relevant for all areas, including STEM. To create an open-minded workplace, I think it's important to have open discussion, visible role models, and also support from your colleagues and the leadership to create an environment where everybody's happy to be themselves at work.